am going to spotlight Jan's video once I'm finished introducing her. All right, so thank you all tonight. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the Combat Zone, Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice. We're joined tonight by author Jan Brogan for a presentation on her new book. It's hard to remember just how poor and how violent Boston was in the 1970s. Violence in the schools where kids were getting stabbed, violence in the neighborhoods where houses were getting firebombed, even violence at the city's tourist attractions, where members of a Black school group from Pennsylvania visiting the Bunker Hill Monument were beaten by 3 whites with hockey sticks. In an overwhelmingly white criminal justice system, from police to prosecutors to judges, all white juries in Massachusetts and the nation routinely decided the fates of Black defendants and what constituted as justice for Black victims. So in discussing tonight's book, A Combat Zone, Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice, Jan will explain how the 1976 murder of a Harvard football player in Boston's old combat zone left a lasting imprint. The tragedy led to the cleanup and eventual demise of Boston's troubled red light district and changed the way juries were chosen in Massachusetts and the nation, a small but significant step in a criminal justice system that still needs reform. So Jan Brogan is a journalist and novelist living in Boston. She's a former staff writer for the Providence Journal and the Worcester Telegram. Her freelance work has appeared in the Boston Globe, Boston Magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, and Forbes. And you can learn more about Jan at her website, www.janbrogan.com, which I'll post in the chat. And I also, once again, want to thank the Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. And I also want to thank the libraries working towards social justice collaborative, specifically the Haverhill, Chelmsford, and North Reading libraries for partnering with Tewksbury for this event. So everyone, what do we have here? About 35 folks live on Zoom and another 10 or so on Facebook. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jan for joining us here this evening. And Jan, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, first, thank you very much, Robert, and thanks to the Tewksbury Library for having me, and for everyone taking the time to tune into this presentation or this book talk. So I made a decision to write about this book. I left mystery writing because I really wanted to find a story that needed to be told, and I felt that this was a story that needed to be told. The Andrew Popolo murder was the most highly publicized murder in Boston or in Massachusetts in the 1970s. It's really misunderstood, and a lot of people still have a different view of what happened to it. But my book is about. There's actually 2 Harvard football players who were stabbed, but this focuses on Andy Popolo, the effect the murder had on his family, the effect the murder had on the city, and the state, and eventually on the criminal justice system. And there's also a side story. I also explore, he has a younger brother, 19 years old, and he really struggled with the murder. And 2 trials. Criminal trials are extremely hard on a family. So this book also explores kind of the fine line between justice and revenge. So with that said, I want to put you back in Boston in 1976. I lived there. I don't live there now. I live in Dedham, but I lived there at the time going to college, and I had no idea that what was going on. I mean, I probably should have understood when I could afford an apartment that property, that it was a lot, that it was a lot less expensive than today. I mean, Boston today is so affluent that you forget, or that in the 70s, it was really poor. It was like one of the poorest. I mean, northern cities in general weren't doing well because of the white flight that happened in the 50s and 60s, really, due to federal highway programs. But everybody was leaving the cities. The middle class was leaving the cities, jobs were leaving the cities. Boston had Southie had the highest rate of urban poverty in the nation. I think it might have been white urban poverty in the nation, but it was poorer than other cities because it had a higher immigration rate. And when people are new to the country, they're poorer. So you had a lot of Irish and Italians just coming in. You had it was the baby boom, so a lot of those were adolescents, boys who were fighting each other. The city was very divided. It was if you were in Charlestown, you couldn't go to the north end without getting beaten up, and vice versa. It was a very divided city ethnically and racially. So it's so in the center city, Mayor White had come in and he had started to make big changes, but he was dealing with a center city that was very deteriorated. Particularly, I'm talking about the combat zone, which is Lower Washington, a 4-block area, and it's been deteriorating for a long time. And in the 60s, really, the adult entertainment industry, which was eliminated from Scully Square when they bulldozed it to put up the new city hall, slowly makes its way down Washington to Lower Washington and into an area called the Combat Zone. And it's called the Combat Zone because even before the adult entertainment industry got there, it was full of bars and theaters, and it's where the sailors used to come from leave, and they'd get in fights and battle and end up in court, and one judge named it the Combat Zone. So in the 70s, 1976, the buildings are deteriorated, and it's this 4-block area. It's almost like a pornographic DMZ. It's the one area in town where the races and the ethnicity can mingle, but it's also very poor, and crime has something like quadrupled in the decade. And there's pickpocketing, and there's mugging, and there's fights, and there's stabbings, and it's really a crime-ridden area. And yet it's got all this neon and these theaters and it's the beginning of the sexual revolution. And pornography is now in the theaters because this is before the internet or VCRs, and people go to the theater for these films, and it's getting a new social acceptability, and that is very controversial nationwide. It's very controversial when Boston's method of dealing with it is setting up a 4-block area where they're allowing adult entertainment, but what they're really trying to do is restrict it to that 4-block area. But because it's Boston is seen as the city of the Puritans, this seems like such a departure, and nationwide it's very and in the city too, it's very controversial. It's mixed with. It tends to be, it's when they first decide on this plan, they're supposed to increase police presence. They're going to do all this, improvement of the area, but that doesn't happen. It's poor. The police department at that time, particularly in the combat zone, it was called District 1, which also included the North End and the waterfront. It's really corrupt. It's so corrupt that the police chief actually, the police commissioner actually, he conducts a 32-month secret investigation on his own police department, and he makes it public. So this is and it's made public exactly 1 week before this murder. And as part of that report, it states that they knew for a long while, it'd been in the press before this, that these women dressed as prostitutes would sidle up to the drunks leaving the bars, and it was called the fondle, and they would distract them and steal their wallets. This was a very common practice, probably not just in the combat zone, probably everywhere. But the new wrinkle in this report states is that now they have male protectors. These are men who get a cut of the wallet, and they're there to protect the woman if the mark figures it out and goes after her and complains. So that's the setting a week before the Harvard football team decides to go to the combat zone. And this is why would they go to the combat zone when the week before it's just been announced the most crime ridden? This is how to show you my it was a Harvard ritual. Can you all see that? It was a Harvard ritual. So 40 to 50 Harvard football players go to a private show at the Old Naked Eye. And this is the Old Naked Eye at the time that specialized in an all college girl review. All right, so I'm gonna so they go down there and they have a private show. It's the end of the season, and it's a private show in the back of the Naked Eye. And when they're leaving, Andrew Popolo is actually he's a medical student. He's got exams the next day. He's in a car, in the back of someone's car, ready to go home as they disperse, when another group of football players get sidetracked by a prostitute. They wind up talking about rates, and they all wind up in the Harvard van for a couple minutes before she bolts. A wallet is missing, and they go chasing her. That chasing ends up in a fight, and at the T stop, where one Harvard football player, Tommy Lincoln, gets stabbed, but not critically, as they run back to the van. And then the three black men who were involved in that fight chase the Harvard football players back to the van, and that's where Andy sees one of his teammates in distress, and he goes to help him, and he gets stabbed to death. He gets stabbed not once but twice. Once when he's in retreat, he gets and he's taken to the hospital, and he arrives DOA. They revive him, and they are optimistic, but after a month in the hospital, he dies. So that's the murder, and these three black men are immediately labeled as pimps and protectors, and they're arrested at the scene. And when Andy dies in December, 3 months later, it goes to trial. So this is not an issue of mistaken identity. Leon Easterling is the man who stabs him to death, and he admits to it. He admits to it on the stand. But what's controversial about it is that three black men are charged. Now, one of them was involved in the fight, and he was in the fist fight with Andy when he got stabbed. But one of them, Richard Allen, was just there, and they were using something called joint venture. So they go to trial, and so this is where it becomes very much like, I don't know if anybody's following the Ahmaud Arbery case, but where they have an all-white jury, the prosecutor uses his peremptory challenges, which are the challenges each side gets. They could just eliminate somebody they don't like, to eliminate 12 out of 13 black jurors. And in an almost all-white jury, there's one black on the jury. They convict these three black men of murder in the first degree. Now, the thing about juries, which is kind of interesting, what I've learned in a highly publicized case, I'm pretty convinced it's almost like they're channeling the public sentiment, which I guess is what they're supposed to do. But in this instance, this trial is a lot about, it's not really that much about, it should be about the brutal murder and just the brutal murder, but it's also about the combat zone. It's during this time, once Andy, when he gets stabbed, it's in 300 newspapers across the country, because because it's pornography, it's the combat zone, it's Harvard, it's three black men charged with murdering a white 21-year-old Harvard student. So it's about the combat zone. It becomes about, I mean, it's a little bit, there's race is always involved. Initially, it's more about the combat zone than it is about race. But I mean, ABC comes to Boston to do a special on, I think it's called Sex in the Sex in the Underground or something. New York Times this year, the Wall Street Journal. This is a big, big story, and it's the cops come in and they did what they called saturation enforcing. So they blanket the combat zone with police moving the stopping the sex trade, which really at that time was going on in alleys and in the bars, and like through car windows there were solicitations. It was everywhere, and all of a sudden it's blanketed with cops. All the businesses are losing money, and at the time, one of the things in the police commissioner's report was that the adult entertainment industry in Boston was 40% mob owned, and there were and they owned a lot of the ownership was hidden, and so they're pretty. So since Andy was from the North End originally, he isn't. The family moves to Jamaica Plain before he goes to college, but he was raised in the North End. His family his father works in the North End business. His grandparents there, and also the mob is headquartered in the North End. At the time, the Massachusetts mob is headquartered right in the North End, and they're losing money. They're losing like millions of dollars a week on this on the closing of the combat zone. So there's all, like, reporters I talked to said nobody thought there was actually going to ever be a trial. They were pretty convinced that the three defendants were just going to be whacked in prison, and that's what everybody on the street was telling Danny Popolo, his younger brother, that there's never going to be a trial. These guys are going to get whacked. They're going to, and this is a couple years after The Godfather. So vendettas there's this whole glamour to vendettas and glory to it that people believe in, or they think is noble. So nobody thinks there's going to be a trial, but there is one. And that's where the prosecutor uses his peremptory challenges to eliminate 12 of 13 potential jurors. So they're convicted, and then there's an appeal, and the attorney Henry Owens, who is representing Richie Allen, who was the black man who was just there and didn't actually had no physical exchange with anybody. He knows from the beginning that he's going to lose this trial, because the Judge Roy, he sees as they call the hanging judge. He believes he's brought in when the state needs a win. So from the very and he wants his client's case separated from the other two. When that doesn't happen, he decides to sets up an appeal from the very beginning, from the very moment of jury selection. Jury selection, much like the Arbery case, is very contentious. It takes 2 weeks. And every time the prosecutor, Tom Mundy, strikes a black juror, Henry Owens challenges it, raises an objection, wants it in the record. And so it's very clear what he's doing, just from the beginning. It's very clear what his strategy is, and it doesn't disturb the prosecutor or the judge, because at that time, federal case law completely upheld the lawyer's right to peremptory challenge, and they basically made discrimination really hard to prove. So on appeal, so this is March 1979, and the jury, it's also during busing, and so and it's sort of still the early days of busings, and whites are really furious. They're really furious that they have to send their kids to schools that they don't want to send them to, and they're really not in any mood to consider the rights of black defendants, particularly black defendants from the combat zone, who were not young kids. These guys had long criminal records, so they've been working the combat zone for a while. So 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 all the sympathies with the Popolo family prior to the trial and at the trial, and then as soon as these convictions come down, it's like the world changes in 5 minutes. It goes from being totally sympathetic to the victim to totally sympathetic to the defendants, and you can imagine how hard that is for the family. And all of a sudden, there's talk about harsh justice, and 3 heads have to roll for one. And there's also other things going on in the city where some black victims are not getting, like a 19-year-old, 18-year-old, I think, Brian Nelson of Medfield, gets killed in a fight with like 3 black guys and 9 white kids, and he gets stabbed and beaten to death with a tire iron. And because the defendants are white and the victims are black, only one person gets charged, and it's for manslaughter, and he gets acquitted. So there's this kind of stark contrast, and the city's changing. The city's evolving. The protests, people are getting sick of the violence of the protests. They vote out Louise Day Hicks. They vote out Pixie Palladino. These are the kind of the firebrand politicians who are very, very divisive, particularly racially. And they elect, I think, John Bryant, who's the first or second black ever to the school committee. And people, the violence, the white violence is against whites is getting a lot of press, and people are starting to get sick of it. Even whites are starting to get sick of it. So that's the 2.5 years between when the case gets appealed and the Massachusetts High Court says, you know what, you can't do that. They said there's enough evidence to convict all 3 of them on for murder in the first degree, given the joint venture provisions of the Constitution. There are that they say, yeah, you know what, it's not crazy. The jury had every right to find that, but this jury selection is all wrong, and so there has to be retried. And you can imagine how hard that is for family, because they've been through it once, and now they have to go through it all over again. And the question is, will they get justice? So so this is very much like the Arbery case, right? So Massachusetts, when it makes this ruling, California had done a similar ruling like maybe 3 or 4 months before, and Massachusetts is at the vanguard of jury reform. And to tell you the truth, because it's called the Soares decision, and now they say you can't just strike jurors. I mean, you can strike them, but if we start to see a pattern and like 3 or 4 of them are black, we're going to challenge it. And so they're looking for patterns of discrimination. And then there are a couple of cases after this that actually tighten it up. So it puts Massachusetts at the forefront of jury reform. And it's today, it's still at the forefront of jury reform, because even though federal law uses this case to enact in its Batson versus Kentucky decision, which is the federal law that now says you can't do it. The Massachusetts ruling has more teeth. In Batson, all they have to do is come up with the prosecutor, as they did in the Arbery case, can strike 12, 13 black guys, and then all they have to do is kind of make up a race neutral reason for it, and it's okay. And in Georgia, they said it's okay. There's a YouTube from a Philadelphia prosecutor who did a train. It was leaked. It was a training video, and how he taught his prosecutors to just make up all these excuses to to get rid of black jurors, and it's really quite racist, because it gives all the reasons why you absolutely don't ever want a black on your jury if you're a prosecutor. Um, so so the book deals with a lot with the criminal justice system. Now, 2.5 years, there's a second trial, and it has vastly and the jury is chosen under these new protocols. So there are 3 blacks on the jury, and it's a different world. It's really, I mean, they have a really much better defense. They have high powered defense, and that makes a big difference. But it was still a very, very, very close trial. But one of the things that happened 3 weeks before the trial, Darrell Williams, he's a 15-year-old black football player, is shot on the field of play. He's on the football field, and he's shot by 3 white kids from a rooftop, and he's paralyzed for life. So now the horror or the outrage that was about the combat zone prior to the first trial, now the outrage is about justice for blacks. And I mean, it's justifiable. There's also recently been before this, there was a Globe Spotlight series showing that black defendants were black defendants, when they were convicted, had much stronger or much longer sentences for the same crimes as whites, and they were sent to worse prisons. So the tone of Boston has changed, and it's a long evolution, but there is improvement from in the racial situation or the awareness that Boston has racial issues in this 2.5-year period. So then the book also goes into, where does this leave the family? And one of the worst things for the family, one of the worst things about the whole thing is that the victim, Andy Popolo, who was was a working class kid who did everything right. He worked hard to get into Harvard and be in the football team and be a pride of his family. And all he did was, he wasn't chasing any of these prostitutes. He wasn't involved in it. He just saw his teammate getting hammered against the van and went to help him. And he gets killed, and his name gets associated with racism. The other thing is, of all the kids, he was the least, he had the most black friends on the team. And I talked to a lot of students or classmates at Harvard and at Boston Latin, and they would say he looked at himself as an underdog, and so he always made the effort for his black teammates. But his name, the Popolo name, gets associated with racism, and it wasn't his crime, or not that he had any crime, but and also, the family has to deal with, what was he doing in the combat zone that night anyway, and I think one of the things I learned through this book, his younger brother becomes obsessed with revenge, and I did a lot of research, and that's a really common thing for survivors of murder victims, and so it's a lot about his struggle with both justice and revenge. And I think it says a lot about the struggle that goes on. I understand a lot more about the inner city now and gang warfare and what's driving these, 16 or 17-year-olds, in the city who are gangs to murder each other. It's a lot of it has to do with the trauma of experiencing a murder, that's close to you. So I will open it up to questions. I don't want to give too much about the book away, so I will open it up to your questions. Before I do that, I'm going to show you a picture of the a picture of the victim and of the defendants. Hang on. So, okay, so this is Andy Popolo. This was taken in 1976 for his medical school application. He is 20 here. He's 20 when he's stabbed. He'll turn 21 while he's in his coma. He's in a coma for a month before he passes away, and he dies still hooked up to life support. And then I stop the share.
So Jan, we already have 4 questions. All right. So
I'm just going to put up. I'm going to put up the pictures real quick of the.
Yeah,
victims.
Please do. The victims and the
the defendants rather.
The defendants, yes.
Yeah.
Please do.
Okay, so this isn't the greatest photo in the world, but this was the artist rendering of the courthouse, and this is Richard Allen. He's the one. He's about 36 at this time. He's a bouncer or enforcer, as he's called in the combat zone. This is Edward Soares. He sells jewelry in the combat zone. He is 33, and this is Leon Easterling, who brutally, really, he stabbed Andy to death. All right, so okay.
So Jan, can you talk a little bit about you talked about race neutral arguments for bouncing jurors, potential jurors, dismissing them so they don't serve on the actual jury. These are challenges that both the prosecution and defense attorneys have. What are some examples of race neutral arguments?
They'll say these do not work. This is for federal or other states and federally. It's a little bit tighter here, but they'll say something like, well, he's from he lives on the same street, or he looked at me and he narrowed his eyes when I was talking, and I don't think he believes me. Because the point of the peremptory challenge is for each lawyer to get a chance this is supposed to be to dismiss the juror they think has a bias against their side. Really what it is, they're not looking for bias, they're looking for people who are on their side. They're looking for every advantage. It's, trials are a competitive sport, and they're looking for advantage. So race neutral is like any other way. He looked at me crosswise. He seemed to know because they get interviewed by the judge first. And so when he was talking to you, he seemed to know more about the case than he let on, so it goes to the facts of the case or an association with anybody in the trial. Like, so for defense perspective, his second cousin is a cop, so there's all sorts of ways you can go. And so like in Massachusetts, when you do that, they start to look for a pattern. Okay, this is like your fifth guy, so there's a lot more scrutiny. But federally, I think it depends on state. Obviously, it's not much scrutiny in Georgia, but.
All right. So Mary Ann has a couple of questions. You referenced the Aubrey case, and Mary Ann wants to know how much has actually changed in Massachusetts and nationally since the trial that you described. Well,
in Massachusetts, I talked to a lot of defense attorneys, and they said that you can. So the problem starts with the jury pool, right? Where you get the jury pool from. And there are ways to keep blacks off the jury pool, which is historical, which like, you only invite certain people who who are, have to go through a jury commissioner who decides whether they're intelligent enough, whether they've got good character. So, but that's pretty much over. And in Massachusetts at the time, they were taken from the voting registry rolls, and at that time, blacks did not vote at the same rate. And so, even though I think at the time Massachusetts was 16 or 17%, or Boston, Suffolk County, where this took place, was maybe 16, 17% black. In a jury pool of 182 people, there were only 13 blacks. So you don't have that many blacks to start off with, and then the prosecutor uses his peremptory challenges to get rid of them. But in Massachusetts now, I've had defense attorneys say, even if you strike one black, if there's only one black in the jury pool, they could see that as a pattern. Like, what happens is your opposing attorney challenges it, the judge decides, and even if the judge doesn't decide, they set up the appeal, and convictions have been overturned, and maybe they will be in the Arbery case, depending on how it goes. Well, they're like, I don't know if you can because it's defense, but in prosecution, they could be overturned based on these challenges. So, and then there's subsequent cases in Massachusetts that tightened it up a little more. The Batson decision is much, it's pretty much considered a joke, even though they went by a lot of the same protocols. They never tightened them up, and right away they just depends on the state and the judge. They just accept these race neutral reasons. I really think the only solution is to get rid of peremptory challenges or limit them. It's like 3. The problem is in murder trials, the lawyers get the most peremptory challenges. In other cases, they get fewer. So,
yeah, well, that answer addresses another question, which I'll skip. So Marianne also asks, can you address the idea of vigilante type behaviors? Is that something you referenced?
No, I'm not sure what.
Yeah, so Marianne, why don't you type some more context there so Jan can answer it adequately. So Elaine asks, I think it was mentioned that at the second trial, the defendants had a different and stronger defense team. Yes. I'm wondering who paid for the second defense team.
No, there's nobody paying for this. They're considered indigent, and these are taken by Norman Zalkind, who's a pretty renowned Boston defense attorney, and Andrew Good, who was a young attorney at the time, but very ambitious, and Henry Owens didn't get anything. I mean, you get the state gives you a budget, but it's really small. It's not like the OJ case, where they make defense attorneys make a lot of money, because he had a lot of money. I think defense attorneys do it for a bunch of reasons. These Zalkind and Owens and Good were very much in the civil rights movement, and wanting to affect change through law. And it's also, if they it's got to be good for business. They're high profile cases.
Melanie asks, are the 3 men who were convicted still in prison?
No. So they're all dead. Rich Allen died of AIDS from drugs, and in I think the 90s, Edward Soares, who was 33 at the time, I think he died of a heart attack. I that's what I've heard. I didn't have that confirmed. I had Richard Allen's death confirmed, and Leon Easterling gets out of prison, and he actually contacted me, and because I was because I wanted to know about these people, and I thought he was dead. Actually, at the time, I was asking people if they knew him, because that's what Danny had been told, that he was dead. And I get an email from him. I actually had to make him prove that he really was Leon Easterling. And he said he was willing to talk to me for a price. And, journalists don't pay for information. So I never, and then he followed me for a while on social media, and then he passed away.
Jane asks, how did the media inflame or moderate the situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm a journalist, right? So I believe in reporting, but when you look at how the media reports a murder, you should really reserve your judgment, because for one thing, it all happens really fast. It's competitive, and people get facts wrong, small facts wrong. I say that in the initial reporting, the court coverage was awesome. Later on, the court coverage I thought was excellent reporting, but the reporting that gets done, it's happening so fast. So there's bound to be mistakes, and it inflames everything. And really, there's no way it's no way for the publicity not to affect the jury unless you change the venue, and you move the jury to another, the western part of the state, and the criminal justice system almost never does that. It's expensive. These jurors were sequestered together, which actually wasn't good either. They found that sequestering juries forces them to make quicker decisions, and because they want to get out. And the second jury was really a factor because they were sequestered up until Thanksgiving, and if they didn't come up with a decision, they were going to have to spend, Thanksgiving in a hotel with each other instead of with their families. So there was pressure to create a decision. But the press, there's no question that the press inflames the situation. And one of Norman Zalkine told me, and I said, well, what do you think the impact of that Darrell Williams case was? That shooting. And he said it didn't hurt. He said, the publicity before a trial has a huge impact on it. And even sometimes during a trial, the jury isn't supposed to be looking at publicity, but they know things, they hear things. So publicity is huge, huge factor.
Rosamond asks, did you find that people were willing to cooperate with you when you were researching for your book?
Yes and no. I found that the Harvard students were great. The prosecutor was dead, but I found assistant prosecutors who were involved in the second trial. Lawyers are great. They're of the family. It started with the family, so I had their cooperation, which was pivot, which was key, which I couldn't have done the book without their cooperation and their memories and their help. But I had a really hard time getting at the defendants. Leon Easterling's family, like his wife agreed to talk to me, and we were supposed to meet in New Hampshire, and then she was under pressure from from his family not to talk to me, and his sisters didn't want to talk to me, and I tried to reach his nephew, and it was at 40 years after the time. It's hard to go back 40 years. I guess probably 30 years when I started this, 35 years, because people are hard to find. So I finally did get some people through online chat boards about the combat zone. I did find people who were close to Easterling and knew a lot about him, and about a little bit about Richie Allen. I had the whole Portuguese community working for me, trying to get more on Edward Soares, because he was the one who kind of fascinated me the most, because even though he had a criminal record, he hadn't done nothing for 30. It ended in his teens, and he was like 33. So he obviously had trying to clean himself up. And he was the only one who expressed remorse for what happened that night. So I really wanted to find people who knew him. And I had the whole Portuguese community. It was really great. They were like, this one woman was contacting everybody, and I couldn't, we never found anybody who knew him. But the lawyers and the Harvard students and like Andy's coaches and the family, they were wonderful.
So going back to Mary Ann's question, she was actually referencing an article that she read independent of this presentation. And it was actually on the other ongoing race-related trial that's happening in America right now. Well, I'm sure there are many, but the other one getting a lot of attention is the Kyle, whose name I'm going to mispronounce, Rittenhouse.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, in that, and I'm less familiar with that case, but I believe that there's of the jury and the alternates, there's a total of 20, and that only one of those 20 is a person of color as well. So somewhat of a similar situation going on there, although I guess that particular community does not have a significant minority population. But anyway, I don't want to speak too much to that case because I'm somewhat unfamiliar with it. But Mary Ann says, I read a piece referencing the Kyle Rittenhouse trial as being an example of this. I watched the trial this afternoon and found it very difficult. The references were about law enforcement, judge, and defense attorneys. And the original question was vigilante type of behaviors. So if you can't answer that question directly, I'm still not quite sure. Do you have any comments? Are you following the Rittenhouse case?
I'm not following that one that closely, but vigilante would also apply to the Arbery case, because these were three white men who saw this black man in their neighborhood and went after him. So you know, I think if you are personally attacked in your home, you clearly have rights to self-defense, but I think it's always problematic when you take justice into your own hands, as actually the book is dealing with Danny trying to take justice into his own hands. So if you read the book, you'll know how I stand on that. But let's just say I'm not a big fan.
And Jan, how can people read your book? Where is your book available?
It's available at barnesandnoble.com. It's available at Amazon, although I just looked today and they were out of stock. It's available at your I know it's at the Brookline Booksmith, and your local bookstores, and hopefully at the library.
Yeah, I was going to see if you were going to mention that. Let me see where we are with that. I'll check to see if it's available. I know that we definitely ordered it, but like some of the bookstores, we're also having significant delays.
There have been supply chain issues with this book, which have been
your book's probably on a ship on the coast of California, but maybe not. I'm not sure. Well, I will say that we do own one of your fiction mysteries, A Confidential Source, Jan.
Yeah. Yes.
Ring a bell? Yeah.
Yes.
So we do have one of Jan's detective stories at the Tewksbury Library. Billerica Chums for Drake and Lowell also on a copy
and
of
that one I sold the rights. It's under development for a television series.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, this is Steven Soderbergh, Transactional Pictures.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been delayed by COVID, but they were supposedly a couple of weeks ago they were interviewing directors. So
wow.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations there.
Thanks.
And I'll get you out of here with this question, and maybe you just answered it. But what is next for Jan Brogan? Do you have any other projects in development? Anything else you're working on?
Yeah, I wrote a historical novel about the women who went whaling with their husbands in the 1800s, and it's set during the Civil War when whale ships, people don't know this, were actually prey to Confederate raiders. So while the Civil War was raging here, Confederate pirates, they called them pirates, raiding ships, the Navy was attacking whale ships and burning them at sea. And so it's set during that time, and it's about three women, two of whom go to sea. I used to be a sailor, so I'm very fascinated by the women who on a whale ship for 4 years at a time. So that's being refined now for my agent, but that's next. And then after that, I don't know. I love writing fiction. But I like promoting nonfiction better, to tell you the truth, because it's true story and it's
Sure.
us all.
Well, Melanie says, thank you, Jan. Very interesting. ML Bell plugs your mystery series there. There are four titles in the series. She says they're terrific. Rosamond says, great talk. Thank you. Robert also says, thank you. Great. Well, very positive feedback. So why don't we leave it there, Jan, as we approach 8 o'clock. Want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and speaking to us tonight. I hope that we didn't disappoint. I know, like, you know, Boston Public Library is like the mecca of all libraries. So to do the BPL and then come to us, and of course you were in person at the BPL, whereas you're virtual here. So we appreciate you including the smaller libraries on your book tour. Jane also says, great presentation. It was like history came alive. And she says, thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I really am, and I'm appreciative all the time of the people who took the evening to spend with me. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. For those watching live, look for an email from me with a link to a feedback survey and a link to the recording tomorrow morning. Happy Veterans Day, everyone. Thank you to all the veterans in and around Tewksbury and all the other communities that are involved in tonight's program. And if there are any veterans on the line, thank you for your service. So thanks again, Jan, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a good night, everyone.
Night.